Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM channel 141. This is the Inside segment. I'm Harold Fisher. We're at the Reporters Roundtable looking at some of the top stories of the week. As always, there is a lot going on. We're going to touch on the very latest with the Trump administration, an assassination threat against House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, the federal government shutdown, and much more. My guests are Charles Robinson, correspondent with Maryland Public Television, and Brandon Tinsley, national politics reporter with the Capital B News. Guys, thank you so much for joining the conversation. I appreciate it. Let me jump right into this breaking news about the NBA before we talk about anything else. As you know, more than 30 people are facing charges in connection with illegal gambling. FBI Director Kash Patel announced the investigations uncovering illegal gambling operations as well as a sports betting rigging scheme. Miami Heat player Terry Rozier, former coach Damon Jones are also accused, and Portland Trail Blazers coach Chauncey Billups was arrested in connection with a poker scheme involving, of all things, the Italian-American mafia. Rozier and Billups are on leave from their teams as the league is reviewing the indictments. Well, I mean, my goodness, just when you thought that the big news was the NBA was starting back up this week. Charles, your thoughts about this?
Well, first of all, I think it was inevitable. And, we can go back as far as Pete Rose betting on baseball, and he was banned from the sport. The sports leagues, the major ones that include both the NBA, the NFL, Major League Soccer, and other, if you will, in sundry sports where there are professionals who are playing. Look, by opening up gambling, you kind of almost set yourself up for this. This issue with these so-called poker games. There was a big scandal in Los Angeles about these poker games that were going on. In addition to that, one of the things that you must be aware of is this whole idea that, look, you could literally bet on anything in sports. Literally. I mean, last year, the big news was somebody going to run a touchdown on the opening of the Super Bowl? Mm-hmm. Who's going to kick a field goal? That's how pervasive it has gotten. And to believe that you can get away with it, I think like I said, you can go back to Pete Rose. I was in Cincinnati when that happened. And it was like the bizarreness of it was he was actually betting on his own team.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and that was really the messy thing about that, Brandon, with the Pete Rose scandal. This is still unfolding, even as we speak. We don't know a whole lot, of the details. But I guess from my point of view, you're talking about, look, I'm not a gambler, so maybe I don't have that bug. I'll do the lottery when it, what is it, Mega Millions? When it gets above $500 million, I'll spend $6. But for a lot of people, gambling is recreational. For others, it is an illness. It is an addiction, Brandon. But my goodness, if you're playing and you're not supposed to do it and you're already making millions, come on.
Yeah, and I think for me, there's this sort of like contrast of like trying to, super uber wealthy people trying to make more money and sort of like doing it through like very like deceptive ways at a time when I think a lot of the national conversation is like how much people are like struggling with like people out of work, with like Black unemployment. And, I sort of just, the story is just so sort of like wild and egregious. And I think it just like sort of like highlights some of that, the gap between, people who are very well off versus the rest of the country. Just a lot of my reporting is focusing on like what's happening in like other sectors of the country with how people are making it through if they're a furloughed worker. You know, I won't say more than that. We can get to it later, but you know, so to the you know, media counter programming, we will say, with this story is just pretty wild to me.
Yeah, I do want to go ahead, Charles.
The dirty little secret about sports is that if like I covered the Cincinnati Reds back in the day, and the joke was there was always a poker game going on, and we're not talking little bits of money. You know, we talk about Michael Jordan and his proclivity to literally bet on anything, and you know, even other sports, you know, where there are young men, sometimes older men and women who are involved in this kind of like, well, I'm bored kind of scenario, which is unfortunate because, you know, you would think that you're making sizable sums of money. Why get involved in this?
Yeah, and I think that was the question that, you know, that I was asking, and as I mentioned, for some people it is recreational, for others it is an addiction, and you can, as we know, you can lose it all in both. And so we will continue certainly to watch this. To Brandon's point earlier, I do want to move into some of the political things. Are you buying dancing shoes, Brandon, for the new ballroom that is now under construction at the White House? Well, you know, the demolition is there. 2 days ago, it was 230 million, 250 million. As of last night, $300 million for the ballroom. The money, Brandon, is one thing, but I think the politics and the optics are another.
Absolutely, because I think what I've seen from a lot of people, like reactions on social media and places like that, is the history that you are literally tearing down that can't be restored. You know, I've seen people sort of calling attention again to the fact that, you know, enslaved Black people were part of the labor force, for lack of a better word, built the White House, right? I've seen people talk about it from the perspective of when visitors go to the White House, you often enter through the East Wing. So, you know, sort of like, what does it mean to sort of demolish like the people's entrance, sort of like entryway into sort of like the seat of American government, the executive branch. Contrast that also, or, you know, add that also to the fact that when in July, I think it was July when it was first announced, the White House was like, oh, we're gonna, you know, do some tweaks to the East Wing, and how it's just like slowly escalated since then, right? It's just like, oh, like won't be that much. And now it's like, you know, I think AP, the Associated Press had the first photos today of like, oh, actually the entire East Wing is gone. And sort of like, what does that mean at a moment where we're seeing a lot of frustration, a lot of irritation and anger aimed at the fact that history in other ways is already under assault, right? When we're thinking about our national parks and monuments in DC, beyond Washington, D.C., beyond the DMV, the way that people are sort of literally and figuratively sort of erasing history. I think it's hard in a lot of people's mind to sort of like decouple those two, all of these different pieces that are happening right now.
You know, Charles, one of the things that we've heard just over the past couple of days to what Brandon also was suggesting is that the Trump administration, both the first one and the current one, has been accused by critics of destroying institutions. And this seems to be a metaphor for that. You know, it's one thing to add to. You know, it's another thing to destroy and create new. And some of the defenders of this as we've seen over on some of the other network talk shows as well. Richard Nixon had a bowling alley. Barack Obama had a basketball goal. Michelle Obama had a garden. This ain't that, Charles.
These are the ultimate grifters. Let me just say that up front. In other words, if they figured out a way to make some money off of this, they will do it. Brendan, I'm going to suggest that you go buy yourself a pair of those Trump tennis shoes that they sold if you're going to go to that ballroom. But they are also talking about creating coins and other types of incentives to pay to this. I think probably the ultimate, if you will, condescending attitude is that, well, I lost all that money, and I'm talking about the president when he was sued by various entities and states, and he thinks he ought to get that money back. The joke is it's about the $231 million that you talked about, Harold. But if you think about it from this perspective, it is us who are paying. They're not paying. Everybody else is paying. And they're not in this business, if you will, of the presidency to make sure others make money. They're in it to make money for themselves.
And obviously there were no lawyers on this panel, and Brandon, you may know this, maybe Charles, but look, if you are accused of a crime and you have to hire an attorney to go into court to defend yourself and you win, well, the win is the win, but you don't get the money that you spent on attorney's fees unless perhaps there is some civil litigation and so an organization perhaps or a business that may have been a part of that, they may pay your lawyer's fees. But generally speaking, if you're accused by the state or the federal government of a crime and you win, you're not getting that money back.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of sort of like the money thing is I've seen people talking a little bit with with the DOJ, the $230 million, talking about like the emoluments clause coming back, where it's just like, if you're the president of the United States in this case, then besides the $400,000 salary that you collect, you can't get like another aspect of the federal government to give you money. And so we were just, I've seen sort of Democratic lawmakers, sort of like legal observers saying like, this is sort of like blatantly illegal to try to attempt to sort of like involve people who are under you in the federal government to get you money back or to pay you money that from sort of like cases that were sort of like fairly, properly sort of like brought forward just because you didn't like the charges that were brought against you.
Yeah, and I guess I'm old enough to remember when in government service, federal all the way down to municipalities, even small towns, that if someone raised the question of whether or not something was ethical, or to put it more simply, if a council member or the mayor says, that's a conflict of interest, I can't do that. That full stop. Mm-hmm. That's where the conversation ended. Now, at least in this particular administration, when issues of ethics come up, there's a whole lot of and I think, again, whether it's when you talk about constitutionally or just the optics, Charles, I think that is where we are now.
I don't think anyone within this administration sees a problem with benefiting from the president being the president. I think in the last time that Trump was here, we kind of knew that his kids were making money off that. The deep irony is that they accused Hunter Biden Biden's son, of doing the same thing. I think if we look at a much broader picture, and that includes everything from the Middle East to Europe and even Argentina, if you will, that they see dollar signs everywhere. They're not afraid to say, well, this got us what we wanted to get.
Hold that point, Charles. Don't forget your point. I'm going to take a really quick break and remind our listeners that you can hear this in every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR-FM. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue at the Reporters Roundtable with the top stories of the week. My guests are Brandon Tinsley, national politics reporter with Capital B News, and Charles Robinson, correspondent with Maryland Public Television. Before the break, Charles, we were talking about ethics, money in the Trump administration. Finish your point.
It's real simple that, there is there's a wink and a nod. Now, I'll just call it like that. In other words, if I happen to take some money and you happen to find out about it, well, I don't want you to know about it. We can go all the way down to the secretary who, allegedly took money from the FBI.
Tom Holman.
And and that was squashed very quickly. I think that the other part is like I said, look, Donald Trump was a developer and he sees development in everything that he does. You can look at what he said about the Gaza. Why don't we turn that into some kind of vacation resort? He looks at what's happening in Ukraine and says, can we stop the stuff with Russia in order to move on? But then some things get to bite him in the what, because of just the conflict of interest. And I think Brandon, you can talk to this as well. This idea that they see dollar signs everywhere.
Yeah, it's Brandon, not Barry, but Brandon. I'm gonna let you make a comment. Then we're gonna. That's all right. Go ahead.
Oh no. I think sort of what I was one connection that I was sort of like seeing based on what I've seen other people saying is like in terms of seeing what you can get away with seems to be sort of like a theme of this administration, right? Like you won't know unless you try. And so, I've seen people say it about, these like different colleges and universities with this like compact. And it's just like, oh, they agreed to do X. And then next thing you know, the DOJ is like, great. Also, we need this, and that. And I've seen people say like, all this, you agreeing to do something only showed the administration that you were willing to do what it says. But like, it's not, it's not going to stop there. And so, to tie all that together, I sort of see these different links in terms of basically like seeing what you can do, seeing what the administration can sort of like get away with, what people will comply with. And, if they don't try, they'll never know. And so it's always like a pushing sort of move.
Let me move on to another big issue. Obviously, we are now on day 23 of the federal government shutdown. One of the things that I found fascinating, Brandon, is we are now at the second longest. If this is day 23, prior to that, there was a 21-day shutdown under the Clinton administration in 1996. There was a 17-day one under Jimmy Carter in 1978. Of course, we know the longest one, 35 days in 2018 through 2019. But a lot of people, Brandon, say this one is different. And I know that's something that you have been, reporting on over these past 3 weeks or so about the impact on people, not just locally, but across the nation.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of like what services might not, people might not get SNAP benefits, WIC payments, but these things that people need, starting in November, that now don't seem like they're going to be happening. So, it's not only federal workers, many of whom are in the DMV area, but it's people who rely on the benefits, the services that are taken care of by federal workers, the sorts of like payments that come from federal workers. And so, yeah, it really is something that just has national implications. I have friends who are flying, right? And they're talking about, well, like at airports and TSA agents and things like that, how it's affecting people's ability to travel. But I think, Harold, to your point about like how people are saying like this feels different, sort of the character of this shutdown feels different. I think part of it comes from just some of the messaging and the rhetoric we're hearing around this shutdown. And there seems to be a certain sort of intentional sort of almost like callousness when it comes to, you know, for federal workers in particular. I'm thinking there are already these massive cuts that are happening. And on top of that, it's like, oh, well, if you won't cut, I'm also not, I'm going to see if I don't have to like give you back pay for this time that you're off, and then try to like pass that buck to like sort of like different political players. But just this sort of like almost like death by a thousand cuts that seems to be happening to some people in the federal government this year just seems like particularly seems unique. And one more thing that I'd love to pass to everyone else is I was talking with a Virginia resident earlier this week, and she was talking about how like just jaw-dropping it is to think that like part of at the core of the shutdown battle is Medicaid, right? And she's a Medicaid enrollee, and she's just like the idea that something as fundamental as like someone's access to healthcare is the thing that is like shutting the government down. And it's almost just like, well, you either get your Medicaid or you can get like your like SNAP benefits. Just seems like she was just like, that's such a just seems like such an incredibly like cruel thing to sort of like a wealthy country to put its citizens through. And I think that's something that's really stuck in my mind when we're thinking about how this shutdown feels different from other ones.
I was thinking about that same thing, Brandon, this morning, in the sense of if I could use one word to describe what is happening, I would say cruel, because Charles, just this week, the Capital Area Food Bank held its first federal government worker and federal government contractor food giveaway, perishable food as well as produce. They were expecting 150 people. This was in Hyattsville. They served more than 370 people. And I think the next one was in Bethesda. They were expecting to be available for at least 3 hours. They were completely exhausted. Their supply of food was exhausted in 45 minutes. And these are all federal government employees or contractors. These aren't anyone else. You got to have an ID.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's very cruel, and it's very sad and very troubling, Charles.
Well, let me talk a little bit about the trickle-down effect that's happening here in Maryland. First and foremost, the governor announced yesterday that he was going to lose about 531 jobs within the state that were actually to be filled. But he says he has looked at the data and he's using the data to make that determination. You talk about the food banks, remind yourself, Maryland is one of the great hubs of cybersecurity, and that's everything from NSA to Fort Meade and various other entities. And one of the things you realize very quick, and I had a conversation with a friend of mine out of Virginia, that these aren't low-paying jobs. We're talking six-figure jobs. And, when you move and you find out that that paycheck isn't going to happen, guess what? That's not just food, that's housing, that's energy, and that's other and sundry things that we have not thought about, i.e., the people who go to, if you will, the luncheonette down the street to grab lunch. Well, guess what? You're brown bagging it these days. The other part is I have a neighbor who's at TSA. He hasn't gotten paid. And I'm not saying that he won't go to work, but I can tell you it is a stress factor multiplied hundreds of times. My son was just on a flight from Nashville. I said, how long did it take you to get to TSA? He said, luckily, I knew somebody in the line and I got through. But it was about, he said anywhere from an hour. He got there 2 hours ahead of time just to make sure he wasn't getting caught.
Yeah. And the clock is still ticking, certainly. And so we also are going to continue to follow this. I do want to talk about this story about the assassination threat against House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Charles, I'll start with you. 43-year-old man by the name of Christopher Moynihan was arrested, and his court appearance is scheduled for today. Just on the surface of that, this again is where we are.
Ugly. Let me just say, it's getting ugly. It is getting ugly. First and foremost, what you need to know is the individual who was charged was also part of the January 6th contingent that stormed the Capitol. In addition to that, one of the things that was made known, or at least intimated, was this idea that these people aren't going to go away, which means that so you got pardoned by the president, and you can go around and still do the things that you think you can do. But the other part of that is this, if you will, constant drumbeat of, it's the left that is causing many of these problems. Well, it's the right too. But part of that is that when you start targeting, if you will, officials like the Hakeem Jeffries of the world, you know what? You're going to probably have to start beefing up security in and around you. Look, I believe, wasn't someone arrested at the Capitol yesterday for bringing weapons there? And it's unfortunate that, the news cycle, once you hear one, you almost say, is there another one coming? And that frightens me.
Yeah. Brandon, your thoughts about the Jeffries case?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's a lot of people's fears sort of like being realized, where political violence, the threat of political violence, this is becoming more and more sort of like ever present. Almost sort of like we're in an environment where like those kinds of like violent actions are being like incubated, encouraged. And so I think especially as we get closer to like elections, obviously we have like the Virginia governor's race, New Jersey's governor's race, but especially going to the midterms next year, one thread that I'll be following is also what are the potential ramifications for like voters, right? There are these heightened threats of political violence against political figures, political leaders. But when we're thinking about the people who put those leaders in power, might those threats also sort of be turned to voters as a way to discourage people from voting, as a way to, scare tactics. And so I think as these kinds of stories keep coming out, I'm very curious about like whether they'll sort of expand, the threat will expand. And even when I've talked to, this was the Louisiana Supreme Court case that I was covering the other week, where I was talking to this one really nice woman in her late 70s and was talking about how where she's from in like small to like rural Louisiana, she's like, there are parts where like Black people are afraid to run for office because the threats are still very common, where it's just like, if you do this, then don't be surprised if you end up in like this river sort of thing. Like that really sort of like old-fashioned racism that still is present in places. But when I think of that also as a form of political violence, right? When it's being used against voters, against people who might want to seek political power. And so, I do really wonder what kind of environment is being sort of incubated as we see all of these cases, all of these stories coming out about threats, about text messages that were leaked, about political violence that was actually carried out. I just really wonder what this will mean, especially for Black people going forward.
Yeah, and I think you make such a great point, and I think for a lot of people who have not lived in rural communities, obviously, for those of us in media, I don't know about either, one of you, but certainly raised in the DMV, but have lived all over the country. And these are some of the conversations that I've had with colleagues who have only lived in big cities, have only lived in the suburbs of big cities. But when you go out there, wherever out there happens to be, yes, people have a tendency to forget that little teeny weeny towns and when I say teeny weeny, I'm talking about really small towns with populations of less than 5,000 people, or communities with populations of less than 2,000 people. There are hundreds of thousands of those little towns across this country where there are very, very few Black people. And I've said this before, and I've been saying this for years, and even when I've had conversations with some colleagues, there are places in this country that you could still live your entire life and never, ever see a Black person. You can be born in that town, you can die in that town, you can bank, you can have a job, career, you can buy a car, whatever, you can buy a home and never see Black people. And I say all that to say to your point, Brandon, is that yes, there's still some of that so-called good old-fashioned racism that this country has been a part of for many, many centuries, and it is still an issue. Even to this day. Let us go back to some local news. This is a really interesting story. I think Dr. Samuel Moki was confirmed this week as the environmental director in Prince George's County. On the surface, some people, Charles, may say, okay, who cares? But this is a very complicated story. He was fired way back in, I think, 2014 after there was an investigation. The county executive, Aisha Braveboy, has defended him on this program, as a matter of fact. Without getting too much into the weeds, I guess my question is, if someone is so controversial and some council members say everybody needs a second chance, I get that too. But was this the only environmental director in the country who could do the job, Charles?
Well, I think a lot of times, and I will point to Prince George's County as one of those counties where, it's insular. And what I mean by that, in other words, people and they know you, and you go, well, could you do this job? And they go, well, what about this? And they go, well, we'll take care of that. And I think that's a lot of what's going on at this point. The last part of that is that, yes, you could find environmental individuals anywhere else in the country, but there are so very few. And Prince George's being one of the largest African-American communities in the country, you obviously want to have someone that looks like you. But I think at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, if you will. In other words, if we find that, there are problems, they will come to light. And Prince George's is not immune from problems.
Yeah. Brandon, your thoughts about this?
Yeah, no, I think very similar in terms of like, it seems like a very like complicated sort of case back and forth, people saying like, well, those like the accusations that were brought against Smokey before don't seem like they really hold up to scrutiny, or there are problems with them. But then even with like different sort of like hearings, seeing that like it's not just politicians, for instance, or elected officials who are sort of involved with this, but you're also hearing from like some people, local residents, community people, who have an issue with Smokey's like previous leadership, and so I would be very curious. Yeah, like proof is in the pudding to see, do these issues persist, or these kinds of people sort of like hesitance around his leadership. I think especially when we're talking about like environmental issues, like sewage issues. I mean, those are things that are just like so impactful to people's like everyday lives that I just see so little room for messing up. And so I'd be curious to see like how this unfolds in in the weeks ahead, months ahead.
Well, I mean, to me, this isn't like a police chief. This isn't like a fire chief where these are high profile, and in some cases, at least with the media, this is the environmental director of any municipality is not a name that you're really supposed to know. That's one of those jobs where just make sure that you clear the dumping, which Aisha Braveboy, the county executive, says that is one of the main priorities of her administration, is to clean up the county. And that certainly is a very, very big deal, to make sure that we don't have sewage problems, that within the control of the county, that there aren't any more stormwater issues. But it's kind of like, yeah, but the environmental director, that's not a personality job, so to speak. So if the county is cleaned up, if things are better, again, it's a who cares,
right?
Kind of thing. Yeah. Real quick, Sonia Massey, that trial getting underway this week in Chicago. Really, one of those heartbreaking cases. A county sheriff's deputy is accused of gunning down Sonia Massey after she made a phone call, a 911 call, claiming that there was a prowler near her apartment. There have been questions about, her mental health, certainly, and that she was going to throw a pot of boiling water on him. But prosecutors say that he shot her. She was unarmed. Charles, help us through this. It's almost like we've been here before.
Look, Chicago has its myriad of problems, and that's not including what's going on with the ICE folks up there, and breaking into anybody and anybody's home there, and the fact that the administration has, gone to court to get this okayed. But look, a lot of times, what we see on the surface is not what's going on. I'm not going to suggest that in this case, but the bottom line is, if you live in the Windy City, this is not a place where you want to be involved with any kind of interactions with
the surrounding suburbs. You
don't want to be involved, if you will, with anything having to do with ICE, anything having to do with Chicago police or Illinois State Police. This is, how do I describe this? I don't want to say it's open season, but there is less of a oops than oh, and that's what you get a lot of.
Yeah, Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, I still remember when Sonia Massey was killed last year, when those videos are going around, and just like in some ways, I appreciate the fact that like as much as we've seen these kinds of videos, that like they still mess with they still mess with me, right? Like I remember that was so hard to watch last year. And I remember part of the conversation to me is like, Harold, you already mentioned, people said that she had mental health issues, and sort of like the fear that people have of police or law enforcement being involved in instances where mental health is also at issue, or if there's like some sort of intervention that's needed. But I remember someone posting about how like there was a kind of like religious aspect to this as well, in ignorance on the part of the law enforcement officers, where she had the pot of the boiling water, and she was sort of saying like like I rebuke you, but people sort of like raised in those kinds of like Black religious like traditions being like, that wasn't a threat to them, to the officer. She wasn't threatening the officers, but rather this was a form of like protection for her, right? Of I rebuke like evil spirits in here and like stuff like that, and how there was that cultural ignorance that
point.
Yeah, that could also lead to like, oh my God, she's saying this about us, and so we're going to shoot her. And I remember that that sort of like cultural sensitivity, cultural understanding, cultural knowledge is something that like I had not thought about until I saw someone sort of like going deep on it, I think on Blue Sky, about like I grew up in sort of like a Pentecostal tradition where we would have like said things like this, and really trying to like enlighten people to like what Sonia Massey was actually like saying and doing, and how that was just so out of proportion with her being gunned down. And so we'll see where it goes, where the trial goes. But it's like you said, Harold, like it seems like we've been here before, but it's because like we have.
Yeah, we have. I'm really running out of time. I was going to talk about Jayden Daniels' new injury. He's not going to be playing on Monday Night Football against the Kansas City Chiefs. It seems like Charles can relate to this. Looks like Jayden Daniels and Lamar Jackson are in the same boat. So
they ain't playing, Harold. That's the bottom line. They ain't playing.
Yeah, but in these last few minutes, but there was something that Charles wanted to discuss, which he actually brought to my attention, the Amy Sherald exhibit. It's in Baltimore. Give us some context about why this is such a big deal, Charles.
Very simply, Amy Sherald is the woman who did the Michelle Obama portrait. It hangs in the Women's Gallery in Washington, D.C. You can see it up close and personal. She was supposed to have a new show called Sublime in Washington, but the Trump administration asked her if she would remove a trans individual who looked like she was holding a Statue of Liberty kind of a figure. She said, no, I'm not going to do that. Instead, she is bringing the Sublime show to Baltimore. It will run through April. I would advise your audience to, if you get a chance, to come out and see it. Sherald is one of those figures in the art world that you will be talking about long after this event is over with. But the bottom line is she does incredible work.
Yeah. And it's going to be at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Is free. Mm-hmm. But wherever her work is, as you said, Charles, I highly recommend that you take the time to visit it. It is a once in a lifetime experience, no doubt. Brandon, real quick, what are you working on this week?
Virginia governor's race, the Texas.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, fun.
It's a lot to pay attention to. The Texas congressional district 18 in Texas, that election is coming up November 4th. Those are probably the two biggest things. Also the federal shutdown, how workers are getting through the furlough period. But those are the biggest things. I will say I am going to see that exhibit in Baltimore December 6th. So I already added that to my calendar to check out. So
yeah, there you go. Real quick, Charles, what are you working on this week?
First and foremost, the Virginia legislature is talking about redistricting again, if you will. They used as opposed to using the legislature, they have a separate commission to do this. But the main reason is to counteract what's going on in some of the Republican-led states where they're trying to pack the Congress with more GOP members.
Yeah. Lots to discuss, guys. Thank you so very, very much, Brandon Tinsley, Charles Robinson. I appreciate your time. That is the Daily Drum for Thursday, October 23rd. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.